When I was watching it, I'm like, come on, get to the AI part. It was just like, it just went on and on for hours of like, I don't care about this, I don't care about this, I don't care about this, get to the AI.
You're listening to the Startup Podcast. This is a Reacts episode. Industry insiders having frank debates about the latest tech, politics, and business news. Whether you're a founder, investor, or operator in a startup, you'll gain insights into how current events connect to broader themes and trends that impact your startup, your investments, and your day-to-day operational decisions. The conversation starts now.
Hi, I'm Yaniv Bernstein.
And I'm Chris Saad.
I'm Amir Shevat.
And I'm Elli, Hanson.
And on this week's episode of the Startup Podcast Reacts, we're going to discuss two big topics. WWDC 2024, the moment has arrived. AI, Apple Intelligence has been announced, and we go real deep in what it means for founders and operators moving forward. What has Apple done well, and what could Apple do better moving forward? We're also talking a little bit about Elon Musk's reaction to WWDC and their partnership with OpenAI and his continued trollish behavior, but more importantly, his announcement that they're going to allow porn, adult content on X. Now, this is interesting in and of itself, but we're also going to talk about the implications for society, for culture, the open town square, and what does it really mean to allow free speech, hate speech, pornography, and everything on the product we used to love and call home, Twitter. All that and more on this week's episode. Stay tuned.
This episode of the Startup Podcast is brought to you by Vanta. I get it. You hear security and compliance and you think time-consuming and stressful. But it's critical for scaling your business. Achieving compliance with ISO 27001, SOC 2, Essential 8 or other in-demand frameworks can unlock major growth for your company, help you sell to the enterprise, and establish customer trust. And with Vanta, you can get compliant in weeks instead of months and save up to 85% of associated costs. And just for TSP listeners, you can get $1,000 off Vanta when you go to vanta.com/TSP. That's VANTA.com/TSP for the Startup Podcast.
All right, welcome to the show. Before we get started, Yaniv, we've got to talk about the Startup Podcast Pact.
We do.
We put the call out last episode to subscribe to us on YouTube. A bunch of you did that, and we're so grateful. And actually, I'm noticing a bunch of you are joining us in the comments, which is really exciting as well. And I'm in there replying to everything. Yaniv, I know you're in there. And so that helps also juice the algorithm, but also allows us to have a conversation with you and really unpack what we discuss. So please subscribe to us there. Join us in the comments. Let's get the conversation rolling. This really helps us grow the show, helps feed the algorithm, and helps more people find us.
And just as importantly, it makes me look cool to my 9-year-old daughter because she thinks I'm a YouTuber now.
All right, with that, let's jump into topic number one. The first topic we want to discuss, unsurprisingly, WWDC 2024. It just happened yesterday. I don't know about you guys, but I clear my calendar and watch it like it's Christmas morning. No spoilers, I don't want to know what happened. I need to watch it live. They went through an entire rigmarole and exercise of a bunch of announcements for all the next-gen OSs and kept us waiting with bated breath for their AI announcements, Apple Intelligence announcements, not artificial intelligence. All very exciting. What stood out to you guys? Let's go around the horn and talk about what jumped out at each of us, what we think the implications were, and what happens next.
First of all, I think that this release was an incredible release across all of their product ranges. The amount of updates that they've done was pretty impressive. In some ways, it also kind of felt like it was a release of a whole lot of product dev roadmap items that have been sitting in the backlog for years, really basic things like being able to change the design of your home screen on iOS or gesture UI with Apple AirPods or even just some improvements on Siri. And finally, one thing that I was actually really excited about is that they're finally innovating iMessage, something that I feel like they have been not doing for years and I've been waiting for, that you can snooze messages or send later, schedule send, some basic and really easy things that actually, is an app that we all interact with. Probably one of the most common interacted apps on our phones for iPhone users. But of course, most notably for me was that they spent the first half of it not saying anything about AI. And that, to me, that notable omission was very clear. Even for items that actually had AI enabled, some of the image generation and editing things that they've included in the Photos update. But when they finally got to it, of course, this is Apple, and so they don't miss a moment for a brand activation. And interestingly, I actually read somewhere that Apple has actually never said artificial intelligence on stage. They always said things like neural nets or generative, but they never said AI. And of course, they rebranded it. And I love a great brand moment. So I love the Apple Intelligence take that they had. And of course, a bucket of new diffusion models, generative models, and large language models built by Apple and only brought to supported devices. So I think that's something we can kind of talk about, which is sort of interesting. Also, some of the risks of being smaller models on devices versus the integration with OpenAI, which is also the thing that I'm the most excited about, obviously. And I'm sure we'll get into that.
For me, I had like a highlight, low light. My highlight was the integration with Siri. I think Siri is the bot that I use the most. It's like the interface, the vocal interface, the human-like interface that I use on the car, on the go, using my phone. I love the fact that now it's much more powerful, or will be more powerful. I'd love to see how it actually works. And being empowered by OpenAI, very exciting. So having a startup empowering all the interactions that we're going to have, that's super amazing. And I think we discussed this in one of the past episodes. It's going to make OpenAI even more powerful in our life than it is today. So that's very exciting. But then came the calculator for iPad. Come on, guys. Okay. So you have a calculator app for iPad, or the other one that I'm like as a person who used to work on Android. Now you can move your icons where you want on the screen. Oh, thank you. That's so nice of you, the gods of Apple. So I would say that like I love the innovation that they showed on the artificial intelligence side, not the Apple intelligence side, the artificial intelligence side. But from the other side, their other innovations are like, if you're an Android user, it's like, welcome to the century.
I think Apple Intelligence is what it needed to be. Like, everybody's been talking about how shit Siri is for years. And then since ChatGPT came out, people are like, when is Apple going to finally fix Siri? I think what's cool about what they've done with it, which again is not particularly creative or surprising, but if they make it work well, is going to be really nice, is that it pulls all of your personal sources of data on device so that you can actually ask it to do smart things. You know, I think they spent quite a lot of their time demoing that sort of thing, like add this photo to the email I drafted to Mada and Josh, like I pulled that straight off their presentation, things like that. So, you know, add a new page to this doc. So they actually use the word this quite a few times in the example. So it's like that contextual aspect, which I think AI on its own doesn't have, but if you can integrate it on device, that again plays to Apple's strengths. So if it works well, that will be cool. I'll reserve judgment. Normally with Apple, you can count on it working well, but of course, Siri hasn't worked well for a long time. So that will be interesting. Other stuff, yeah, the iPad calculator, that is just pure like presentation bait. Like, wow, that's really cool. No one's going to use it, whatever. By the way, what this showed is that, you know, you can sort of handwrite a maths problem. It'll solve it for you. Okay, cool. Other things I noticed, updates to Vision OS. I just thought that was interesting because Apple Vision Pro so far has been a bit of a dud. We discussed it when it came out. I think this is one of those version 1 things. They'll keep iterating, and I thought it was nice to see that already just 6 months later, we've got the second version of the OS, and our prediction from earlier on that Apple will just quietly keep iterating. They're not giving up on this thing, I think is really interesting. It's also available in more countries. So again, they are just sticking to their plan, I think, with the Apple Vision Pro. And then one final thing I noted, and I think this is probably, Amir, I'd love to get your thoughts on this because I think it's probably most important for folks in the US where, you know, the banking system is particularly dysfunctional. The addition of functionality to Apple Wallet. They've got this very cool tap to pay peer-to-peer thing, which is like, if I want to send you $20, we just tap our iPhones and this beautiful animation to show $20 being slipped from one iPhone to another. Might be starting to eat into Venmo and stuff like that. But I just thought it was really interesting to see Apple double down on effectively providing these retail banking services.
I can definitely see this as something that I use on an ongoing basis with service provider. I can tell you that like Apple Pay, I would say 90% of my interactions are with Apple Pay, and this will make it a 95%. And I think you hit an interesting point of like Siri connecting to other apps is also super important because it opens up an ecosystem where I can tell Siri to take actions in third-party apps. You hit the nail there where actually it opens up another ecosystem, a vocal ecosystem for the entire third-party apps on that phone.
And it's a really interesting contrast to how Google's done it, where, you know, I've just gone back from iOS to Android. Like to your point, Amir, a lot of this stuff is like welcome to 10 years ago. But their Gemini integration, it really showcases the difference between how Apple and how Google do things, because the Gemini integration is really cool. And of course, Google built the tech themselves, unlike Apple, who are using OpenAI. And although Google has actually more access to data, they kind of neglected to integrate it in their V1. So Apple wouldn't have released the Gemini assistant in its state. Now, I hope and assume that Google are going to be working on it, but for the time being, it's kind of DOA because it's in its own AI silo and it doesn't connect to my personal life.
I don't know that they're leveraging OpenAI underneath. My understanding is, a couple episodes ago, we talked about Apple's proprietary model, on-device model. And it seems to me that they have built what I would imagine to be a fairly limited, fairly small model that runs on device to do client-side app interactions with natural language. And then it reaches out to the cloud to do heavier duty stuff. And then only with permission does it reach out to ChatGPT to do things.
I think one of the really interesting things is that I knew we would talk about how basic it is to be able to change your home screen and those changes, but it's a massive, massive departure for Apple. They've always taken a design-first approach where they believe that their perspective on design should be adopted by their users. And that's been a huge philosophy that's driven a lot of the innovation and approach that Apple's had until today. And to be able to hand over the reins to everyday people to design their own home screens is a really big philosophical departure. And we've seen, I think there was two big philosophical departures that we saw. There's that one, which seems really innocuous, but is actually really interesting from a brand and business perspective. And then, of course, there's the other one, which is the privacy, which the reason Siri has been so lame so far is because they've taken a really strong perspective on privacy and they haven't wanted Siri to be able to go into apps so far. And I think that one of the things they really did focus on is, Chris, you were just saying that actually everything that's happening is on device intentionally and initially from Apple built models. But if there are things that are too complex or outside of the area of expertise of these Apple models on device, it can go one of two ways, which is my understanding. It'll go to a larger server based on Apple Silicon servers using what they're calling private cloud compute, and it'll be slower than something that's being done on the phone. But they're very clear to say that the information is never stored or sent to Apple. And then when you specifically ask for something that ChatGPT would be really good at, it will actually ask you, hey, is it cool if I ask ChatGPT for an answer to this question? And you have to accept that and share your information every time. And that will be taken into OpenAI's model. Now, obviously, that's a huge friction point. But again, just this adoption, this partnership with OpenAI is a departure from their really hard line focus on privacy that they've had so far. But they're not departing from that privacy focus, which I think was one of the questions I had when we knew that we would see this partnership between Apple and OpenAI is, how is Apple going to handle this, especially OpenAI, this company that's had a lot of drama and issues around safety and privacy, and Apple's so committed to that. That's part of their brand. That's part of their mission. They've come out really strong with these statements. At no point is OpenAI allowed to store any of these requests. Apple has said that they obscure your IP address, so OpenAI can't even connect multiple requests to form a profile of you. And the experience needs to be honed to reduce friction, but they're obviously still very committed to that privacy.
So let's geek out a little bit about that. If they don't have context, it's not very useful.
That's right.
And if they don't have a lot of information, it's not super useful. So I think the user experience will slowly drive them to give more information, to give more context, to give more permit. And also, if I need to say yes every time I connect, that's going to drive me nuts. That will drive user behavior.
I really think this whole security posture of Apple, on one hand, serves them very well and is a cudgel in some cases that they can beat Google and others over the head with. But I actually think it may backfire, giving them less room to maneuver in terms of gathering context, gathering compute capacity in the cloud, and building a great user experience. It really may backfire. I think it's overwrought and I think it's overcomplicated. And the fact they spent so long trying to explain and justify their cloud security model, users are willing to trade privacy for utility all day long. And that may become more and more of a sensitive topic, or it may become more of a legal concern. I don't see it. I think Google has the right social contract with users over the long term. And this whole thing of like asking to reach out to ChatGPT is akin to the old Alexa skills model, which was not a successful model. And I think it limited them from being able to build personality and frictionless into Siri in this version. And I agree with you, Amir, that that's going to shift over time. But I don't want to be all negative here because there's a lot to be positive about. When I was watching it, I'm like, come on, get to the AI part. It's just like, went on and on for hours of like, I don't care about this, I don't care about this, I don't care about this, get to the AI. And they just did not want to mention AI, even when it was clearly something you could call AI. It's like they were deliberately avoiding the term, and it was conspicuous. I think the framing, when they finally got to it, of, hey, everyone else has world intelligence, we have personal intelligence. Apple Intelligence is about personal intelligence, and we have all of this access to the stuff on the device. I think that was very clever framing, right? And that's something that, as we've talked about on this show many times, try as they might, Microsoft doesn't really have access to your personal life, and OpenAI certainly doesn't. Google does, and Apple does. And the other thing I thought was, obviously very powerful is they're leveraging their unfair advantage. Siri and Siri's app intents, summarizing the notifications they're already getting from apps, all of their ability to index the apps for search. This is stuff that if they had not done it, would be almost malpractice. And then just one last point quickly. I think this show, one of our unfair advantages is start talking about the people behind the news. We keep talking about Apple and Google and Facebook, but there are human beings behind this news. And I think it's worth digging into who they are and how they think. And in this case, it just so happens that, as far as I understand, the head of Apple Intelligence is a mutual friend and acquaintance of ours, Amir, Josh Ellman.
An awesome guy.
He's an awesome guy. He's very thoughtful. He has a real strong ethic of pay it forward and helping and mentoring people who ask him for help. He's been at all the right companies at all the right inflection points, and he's chosen to be at Apple today, right at this moment.
A great product person as well.
He's a great product person. He's behind LinkedIn and Facebook platform and Twitter. And I just have a great deal of affection and faith in Josh Ellman. And I know whatever shortcomings they have now, limitations, he's going to help navigate that through. And I look forward to seeing kind of the levers he pulls over time there. It's going to be very exciting.
100%. And I think I totally agree with you. And just to close the loop, if I could connect all these dots with Siri and say, hey, Siri, take me to my next appointment in my Google Calendar, so that it will connect my Google Calendar with my maps, with my car, that will be an amazing experience. Just having this voice interface into all these interactions and connecting the dots, I'll press, I agree to do whatever, take all my data and sell it in China so that I can get to my next meeting faster. So I think that the user experience will drive it forward, and I'm super excited about what's coming up next.
I tend to agree. We talked about this on the last time we discussed what we thought was going to be this announcement. I think my perspective on it is that they've been reticent to get to this point, but I think this partnership with OpenAI is really going to allow them to combine Apple's excellence in hardware with OpenAI's excellence. And to your point, Chris, Apple's unfair advantage also in their hardware ownership, and the fact that now really, I think we're going to see an inflection point where there's a lot of categories where Apple actually hasn't been able to build real valuable hardware. I know we've talked about things like home automation in the past, and they haven't really cracked it. And I think it was because Siri wasn't working. I think it was because they had privacy concerns and they weren't really willing yet to kind of take that leap forward. And to me, I'm really excited because I actually think there's a lot of areas for them to continue building out hardware products in our lives that will add to our entire ecosystem. And something I've said in the past is that we're all sitting, anyone who's been in the Apple ecosystem for 20 plus years is sitting on troves of data for your own personalized GPTs. And so I couldn't agree more with this idea that combining OpenAI's intelligence, obviously, with your own personal data to create truly valuable experiences across their devices is going to be a game changer and very difficult to compete with.
If they let OpenAI soar, right, if they let them actually play a first-class role on the platforms, they've basically said, oh, yeah, whatever, if you want to reach out to OpenAI, we'll let you, but don't worry, we're going to plug in all the other models and it doesn't really matter. Like, no, I want Siri to have a personality. I want it to have context. I want it to be creative. I want it to be my one-stop Samantha, whatever. And that's not going to happen if Apple keeps saying, we're like paranoid, concerned about our private security cloud thing. It's just like, let me tick the box. Let me grant you permission. Let me trade my privacy for utility. I will do it all day long. Let's go. Come on. Let's do this.
I'll even not use my calculator on my tablet if you let me do that. I promise.
Exactly. I will give up my iPad calculator for it.
There's actually also a massive risk to Apple in the perspective that they've taken of working on these smaller systems. These smaller models, these owned Apple models, they're prone to more hallucinations, lower quality, and leading to a worse experience design and reduced trust, especially in this really critical time where people are just building their understanding of interacting with AI models and building their decisions of whether or not they trust these models to give them the information that they need. We've obviously seen massive Google flubs with that. And I think these smaller systems on device, they have hardware limitation, and also these models can grow and change so fast. It's a question of how are they going to be able to keep up on the physical hardware. So it's a really important thing you've brought up, and they'll either be forced to adopt it to really integrate in a real way, or there will be a reduced experience design for people, and that will have its effect.
What I was actually thinking about, Elli, is the concept of reliability, which is not something that just affects Apple. But if you think about, why did Siri suck so much? It was a lot to do with the fact that often you asked it to do something and it didn't. And the kind of payoff threshold where it's actually worth using a tool like this is when it gets it right, say 95% plus of the time. It's the same with like voice typing. Like I only started using voice typing when I didn't have to keep like correcting getting words wrong. So while it's all very cool to show off these capabilities, if they only get it right 80% of the time, 50% of the time, you're not going to use it. And again, I'm looking just at this screenshot from WWDC where they're showing all the little things you can tell Siri, right? Like, bring up the article about cicadas from my reading list, or add a new page to this doc. If it does it right most of the time, but not nearly all of the time, it remains a cute gimmick and you will not use it. I guarantee you will not use it. So I think the question for Siri and the question for Google and all the rest is, as much as what are the capabilities, is can you do them reliably? And Elli, I think your point about on-device models is important. So that's Apple's weakness. Google's weakness, I think, in this case is not thinking carefully about experience design. But I think they're probably in terms of the technology and also the access to data. Let me just stash one more point in here, which is Apple doesn't have actually access to as much of people's personal lives as Google usually. They have a lot of location and stuff. But when you think, Amir, you mentioned, connect to my Google Calendar. Where's your email? It's in Gmail. It's sitting in the cloud. It's not sitting on device in your Apple Mail app. So I think there's a little weakness there as well, which is if you're only dealing with on-device data, a fairly big part of a lot of people's personal lives is stored in other companies' services in the cloud.
If you want to be extremely harsh, you could claim that the announcement is, congratulations, Apple now has Siri that actually works. It's kind of like they made Siri, the original Siri promise, work the way it should have been working for the most part over the last few years. And it feels like they failed. It feels like, we haven't tried this thing yet, but it feels like in their attempt to maintain privacy and avoid these large models in the cloud, that they haven't used the state of the art in terms of personality, creativity, conversation, interruptibility, and so on. And so it just feels like Siri has always been. It's always been half a step or a number of steps behind. And now it's like they added home screen icon rearranging. It's out of date. It's welcome to a couple of years ago. I think that's the harshest criticism we could give it right now, but we should hold our criticism and hold our verdict until we try the thing. But it was the permission to ask ChatGPT thing that I think was the most revealing. If you look at my tweet stream, it's like, cool, gimme. Oh my God, yuck. And it's like, no, that's broken and they need to revisit that.
It's a little bit like the paste request that you have in Google when you cut your address and then you paste it into Google and then it's like, do you want to paste? If I didn't want to paste, I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing. So let me paste without asking me permission. So I totally agree. All these AIs are going to be so much powerful when they're interconnected. I think the word that you said, Chris, that is really important here is interoperability. And when all these systems are connected together, that's when it's going to be very, very useful to us all.
But it's antithetical to Apple's world, right? And this whole are you sure you want to paste thing is flirting with being extremely paternalistic. And it's this, Apple is an extremely liberal, and I would say almost woke in some of the more pejorative sense, company. There's a line here that we're flirting with of get out of my way, give me advanced mode, give me some trust here, give me some utility here. And again, this is not black and white. It's a spectrum. It's a line that moves. Different people will have it in different places. But Amir, you and I have talked endlessly about APIs and open standards and open platforms, walled gardens. As we've just both said, the future belongs to context and data and connectivity and interoperability. I'm sure if we had an Apple representative on the call, they would say, yes, but all those companies are going to mine your life and monetize your life, and you will be kind of a cog in the giant cloud intelligence, and we're going to protect you from that. Maybe I want to be embraced by my new AI overlords. Let's
But also, will that clicking OK save that, right? So I think that's another thing. It won't save it because I'm going to click OK anytime and all the time. I'm going to complain. Why are they asking me to click OK?
It's GDPR, cookie accept,
exactly,
right?
Exactly.
Shut up. This is not helpful.
You're right.
It's funny though, Chris, you said Apple being a very liberal, like, I agree with that, but I also actually think that Apple's been an incredibly paternalistic brand and design company for many, many years. I think that that's been a huge part of their success, is that they took this perspective, which was, we know what's best for design. We're going to, whether or not you like it, we believe that we have a perspective on design, on our products, on our experiences. We will serve it to you, and either you will accept it or you will not. The reality is that people have accepted quite a paternalistic approach from this brand for a very long time.
You're right, Elli, 100%. And as a product manager, I'm always encouraging and reminding founders, like, you don't have to accept the complexity in the world. You should have strong opinions, best practices, polished experiences, and great defaults in the Apple style. But what Amir and I are saying is it's reaching its limits in terms of how far that goes. And it's reaching its limits in terms of this moment where context and cloud-based massive models are the advantage versus the privacy model.
Absolutely. And I think that if they're smart, we'll see how they react and how they take steps forward from here. I will reserve my judgment. I hope it works. I completely agree about the friction. I think that it's something that I looked at and was, to me, I thought, what a great way to get enough user data to prove that people want this thing more than they want privacy. So to me, I looked at that. I'm like, great customer research exercise. They're going to say 98% of our people accepted this 99% of the time. And then they're going to say, okay, that means that our customers want this integration. Then there's going to say, well, you guys told us you wanted this and you can opt out in these other ways. And then they're going to move to an opt-out model. And so to me, I think that yes, it's high friction, but they're also potentially taking steps to be able to move. They can't cross that chasm from where they've been to a completely open and integrated. It wouldn't be absolutely out of step and out of line of what they've done for the last 2 decades. So I think it makes sense.
There's 2 little things they could do. Add an always allow button and put their Apple data sharing prompt at the beginning and go, here's what you're sharing with this app developer. End of story. Let's move on.
And they probably will.
Yeah, by the time the beta's done, they'll add an always allow button.
That's going to be the interface. I'll be extremely surprised if it's not.
I'm not so sure, because I think, to the point we've been discussing, privacy is pretty baked into Apple's brand, and we will see. And maybe just as a quick aside, Elon Musk's somewhat amusing reaction to all of this, which is like, Apple integrating with OpenAI is such a privacy threat that he's going to stop his employees from using Apple devices.
Look, that's a great segue, Yaniv, because we wanted to talk about this. For whatever reason on this show, I've been the guy who just kind of is happy to bash on Elon a bit. He has done so many important things for the world. Moving the conversation about EV forward, building rockets, untethering the US from Russian dependency for getting to the International Space Station, helping us imagine and dream bigger. I'll call that old Elon. New Elon, red pill Elon, is a classless, inarticulate, tasteless troll.
Tell us what you really think.
No, it's so frustrating to see a hero or to see someone who has so much capacity for change and good to just perform stunts and stupidity in public. And his laugh has even become like some kind of evil mastermind. It's like, dude, have a holiday. Have a holiday and see a therapist, because please, this stupid stuff, his X exists by the grace of God. Apple App Store allows it to exist. So just hold your tongue, focus on value creation and stop being a troll, please. It's just such a waste of time.
I'm going to reserve my comments until my arbitration with Elon and all.
These comments do not represent Amir and his thoughts, and completely separate and different. Elli, what do you reckon? Am I overstating the Elon trollishness?
No, not at all. I couldn't agree more. I think that this transformation that we've seen is absolutely stunning, shocking, terrifying, all of the above. And, I think we've seen it in a number of different tech leaders. And I think, to me, what I take away from it is I look at what are the lessons that can be gleaned from one individual really having such a great amount of control over emerging technologies and industries. So Elon having such intense oversight and control over the EV market, over space exploration, over these really key areas for innovation. And I think we have to take lessons from what can happen from actors who seem like well-intentioned, well-balanced, well-adjusted individuals today, and we don't know how that can develop. And I think what we need to do is look at someone like Sam Altman. Today, he has a lot of power, but there was quite a bit of news about his investments recently and just how many of his investments are now making partnerships with OpenAI for their AI model development. And I think we have to take what lessons we can from the Elon story and saga. And we have quite a short memory, it seems, collectively. And if we can zoom out, take a look at the last 10 years, 5 years even, and say, okay, well, what can we learn from that? And then how can we actually implement some real safeguards to disperse some of that power? And maybe ultimately it would help someone like that. Maybe Elon wouldn't have gone down this path if some of the power was not quite so concentrated.
I think there's two things here, right? One is, should so much power be concentrated in the hands of any one individual? And Elli, I think you're rightly saying, ideally not. Like, I think that creates existential risk for the world because any one individual can have a lot of vested interest, can have mental health issues, can have anything go wrong with them, and then we're somewhat beholden to them. I think Elon as an individual is a particularly odd version of that story because he is simultaneously still doing a lot of good in the world. Like SpaceX is still an incredible story, right? Like the businesses he's running, with the exception of X, arguably, are still doing good stuff.
Neuralink, it's
And
terrifying.
yet
Neuralink is terrifying, but amazing. It's incredible. Look at what he's done.
Neuralink, Starlink, like
Starlink, yeah.
incredible stuff. And at the same time, he talks like a total fucking moron on his own platform on X. And it's like, how is this the same person? The story arc traditionally is you do good and then, you have your like Darth Vader turning to the dark side moment. Elon is simultaneously like a Jedi and a Sith. And I'm like, I don't know what's going on here.
I don't know. Do you think that there's people around him that are doing a lot of the good now? Like, I wonder, he's not an individual who's sitting in the seat anymore, writing code and doing the development. Like, I do wonder. He's got to have people.
Yeah.
He's got people doing stuff around him. It's not just him.
There's a great team around him doing great stuff, and we need to be careful about the cult of individual personality, right? But I'm skeptical about your premise, Yaniv, which is that he's doing such good. I think he's also wielding that power in ways that are actually not healthy. Like he's skirting FTC laws and trade commission laws, and he knows that the US government is dependent on him for defense, for Starlink, for just his general brand of brilliance and what he represents as a national security threat. I think he says things and does things that I think others don't necessarily get away with. His tweets that move the stock price and stuff. And I think he's playing with that and can continue to play with that in ways that are not healthy.
Companies like Atlassian, Quora, and 7,000 others use Vanta to build trust and prove security in real time. Automate compliance and start scaling your business today. Get $1,000 off Vanta when you go to vanta.com/TSP. That's VANTA.com/TSP for the Startup Podcast.
I want to connect this to a bit of a larger thing. This is now getting a little bit further away from tech, but it really just speaks to this tendency we're having lately around cults of personality. When we agree with the person, we're enthusiastic about them and we're like, yeah, you go and you bash heads and get stuff done. And this is true for the left, I think, with Elon. It's true for the right with Trump. But any individual wielding power that is subversive to democracy, and again, I say Elon is a national security threat to a degree where I think he's starting to push himself outside of some accountability. It's just dangerous. Whether you agree with Trump or not, the power that he's wielding is unhealthy for democracy. If you agree with Elon or not, as formerly, I guess, a liberal champion, now some other weird right-wing champion, that power over these major industries is very dangerous. There are laws to stop companies from wielding this kind of power in markets. It's called antitrust laws. I don't believe there are laws to stop individuals from wielding that kind of power. And so the connective tissue between these initiatives is Elon, not a parent company. And I don't know if there's any good mechanisms for reining in that power when the individual is the one facilitating the cross-pollination versus a corporate entity.
We had for a while, it was called the guillotine.
Oh, God.
Whoa, my
No,
goodness.
I'm saying that's how.
That's not admissible in arbitration, folks.
No, but I'm saying we had, like, when people had too much power, people just went after them. There's a great story in Greek mythology about a person getting a invisibility ring, and he's all good. And the first thing he does when he gets this invisibility ring is kill the king and marry the queen. So, like, abusing power is something that has been throughout our history. And rich people have been always mobbed. And I think it's not the right way to do things. The right way to do it is through laws. If we don't have laws, we will go back to war and other means that are very, very bad. So I think that in the same way, to your point, Chris, we have laws to protect us from too much power of organization. We will need laws protecting us from too much power of a single person.
Maybe just one last point on this. I think there's an argument to be made that maybe Sam Altman is a very clever Machiavellian character who says all the right things, but is self-dealing, placating.
I think that argument has been made.
Yes, and I think, he comes across as quite meek and thoughtful, but is actually doing things that are quite aggressive and ruthless. I think there's a reasonable reason to believe that. I'm not saying I believe it. I'm not saying it's true. I'm saying it's a reasonable reason to believe that. But at least he has enough EQ and enough self-control and enough thoughtfulness to do it with such delicacy and diplomacy that he is outwardly like that. I'm always weirdly...
Yeah, but if one accepts that premise, Chris, that makes him more dangerous.
That's more terrifying. Yeah.
I agree it makes him more dangerous, but it makes him more sensitive to the needs or the perceptions or the calculations of other people, which makes him more dangerous in terms of exerting his will, but at least he has some empathy for other people.
He's avoiding he's avoiding the guillotine, right?
Whereas an Elon or even a Trump, again, let's say for the sake of argument, you agree with all of his policies, but he doesn't have the empathy or the intelligence to articulate himself in a way that is consumable by many. That, to me, is kind of disqualifying in a leader. It's like, you must be able to have enough empathy to at least mask your psychopathy. It seems like a basic requirement.
Yeah, well, I think that ultimately there are many Americans who would disagree and say that his rhetoric speaks directly to them, right? And I think that's why, obviously, we have the situation that we have today, and what the next 4 months will hold for us will be really, really interesting. But I think that I'm fundamentally an optimist, for better or worse. I believe that people can hold two things at once. And I think that Elon is actually an example of this, for better or worse. He can still believe in an EV revolution and building a more sustainable planet, and also have some weird belief that he's supposed to populate the planet. Like, I don't know if you guys have heard about this, where he's like, you can hold two things at once. And I think Sam Altman can hold two things at once. I think he can truly believe the AI models that he's building are going to revolutionize and democratize education, for example, or create solutions to healthcare problems that we've been trying to find for decades. Otherwise, he wouldn't do what he's doing. He can also be a self-led actor that is taking steps to reassure his own existence and success in society, because that's what we do as animals. And I think that both can be true. And I know we're not really going to talk about the whistleblower letter, but the one thing that I would say is just that there are individuals that are really calling for a very reasonable system of checks and balances. And you said that there's no way right now, like if we talk about antitrust, we can talk about organizational checks and balances. But there are ways to set up a reasonable system of checks and balances whereby safety is governed by an external party that would then be able to, in much the same way, assess the actions of individuals within an organization. And I think that that's totally reasonable. And I think that there's one really good example, which was I was living in Los Angeles during the Black Lives Matter movement, and the body cams that came out of that movement were not governed by an external party in terms of reviewing their footage. And in most jurisdictions, they had no real impact, except for in one jurisdiction in Chicago, where they had actually put in a third-party governing body to review the footage. And it was that jurisdiction where the body cams on police actually had quite an impact in police violence, and how that movement actually got to see real changes. At least some data has pointed to it. And I think that this is a perfect example where you can't have a system self-governing internally. And I think that's really what a lot of people are calling for. And I think that it's the same for individuals, whether they're inside an organization or outside.
I want to double down on that. I think that that's a great point. I think the essence of our conversation is that power should be checked, and should be checked by a third party and create balance. And my example with the guillotine is an extreme, like if you do so much bad, people will come and kill you. That's a very bad example. But if you have checks and balances, like having cameras, like having laws, like having all these checks and balances, makes us better humans, because there's accountability for the actions that we take. And what we're seeing is good people, without any accountability, start doing bad things. So we need to add more accountability and more checks and balances.
I think it's worth pointing out that he hasn't actually done anything demonstrably actually bad. He's not like murdering people. He's just a lot of like crazy rhetoric, right? And stuff that just feels trollish, and what he retweets and that sort of thing. And so it does seem like power is concentrating, wealth is concentrating, and this idea that we need mechanisms to provide checks and balances to individuals seems like an interesting thing to discuss. But we just got to be careful about overstating things, right?
Well, I think this is a perfect transition actually into our next topic. The question of whether he's done anything that's actually bad, I think, is up for debate. When we start to look at his recent maneuver to make explicit content available and shareable on X, I think that there are a lot of arguments to be made that this is actually and demonstrably bad. Twitter is responsible for 49% of child sexual abuse content that's found across social media, and search engines and cloud services from 2017 to 2019. So that's before AI. Having said that, Twitter holds single-digit market share across social media, but owns half the child sexual abuse content. This is not a good ratio for Twitter. And I think that this is a huge question about the direction that he's taking X and the implications for society. People can't walk around the mall with no pants on. You'd be booked for indecent exposure. Our society works under these social contracts. If X was meant to be the town hall, they don't hold the right to subject me to explicit pornographic content at their will just because of, in my opinion, just because of free speech. Just the same way that you can't make me watch someone masturbate on the subway. It doesn't work like that. I think we have to think about these digital spaces as akin to physical spaces, and the way that we currently govern physical spaces under these social contracts has existed for a really long time. So I don't think it's fair for people to say, well, if you don't want to see that, don't go on X or don't use the subway. No, society's built to serve people, and our social contracts and systems of governance are there to serve those people. One person's violent actions or ideologies shouldn't remove the right of other people to utilize a public good or service. And this is true in the town hall of X, and this is true on the public transport systems of the subway. I think it's extremely dangerous what he's doing.
I think that's a really valid point. And I think that free speech absolutism is a naive ideology in the same way as kind of basic libertarianism is a naive ideology, because it doesn't accept the nuances and complexity of what it takes to live together as humans in a society. X has been trending like this for quite some time. I've led a sheltered and privileged life and not encountered much anti-Semitism in my life until the last 6 months on X. I'm like, holy shit, it's just like a fucking bunch of Nazis saying whatever they like, and that's okay, right? And yeah, that is not a town square, right? That is just a pit of like race to the bottom nastiness. And yeah, making porn officially part of it is not going to help at all.
You guys are going to put me in an awkward position of defending Elon Musk and pornography. But let me try to do this delicately.
Always fun to defend pornography as a man. Hey, Chris.
Yeah. I know. It's not a good spot. Not a good look. Okay. So putting aside, of course, the very disgusting, dangerous, unacceptable child exploitation, Nazis and so on, let's put all that aside in a different category, okay? Let's talk about properly created with consent between adults, etc., pornography, and also like OnlyFans type stuff where girls have chosen to do that for themselves, their own small business or what have you. I do think the majority of these companies and brands avoid it because of brand, and that forces it to go to dedicated platforms like a Pornhub or an OnlyFans. But I do think that the US in particular, and many Western countries, have this puritanical relationship with sex, which is overstated and overplayed and overwrought, again, to use that word, that I think is just not true in some European countries and some other cultures where it's like, sex is just part of life. And I believe, and I'm not an expert on this, there's evidence also that like making prostitution and things illegal only makes it unsafe for sex workers and all this kind of stuff. And so I really think this kind of knee-jerk reaction to sex content, sex workers is unhealthy for society, and I think it's repressive. On the other side, Elli, to deal with your very real concerns, I would say Elon would argue, and again, here's where I'm in the uncomfortable position of defending him, he wants everything on the platform, and then he wants to give you client-side filtering, consumption-side filtering. So I would imagine, and I'm just reading the article about it, where you have to label the content as adult and so on. And so one would presume you could say, I want to see sensitive content or not, I want to see adult content or not, the default is not, etc., etc. So in theory, one would imagine you're not being forced to look at anything, not in a binary like, well, then don't look at X, but in a sense of like, you can participate in, clean X and not necessarily have this other stuff just pop up in your field arbitrarily and randomly.
You gotta have Kleenex or make sure you got a box of Kleenex, right?
Kleenex. But I think that's the argument for, right? I think the argument for is Elon keeps thinking about things as first principles. And again, he's trollish, he's inarticulate, he's belligerent, and he doesn't express himself well, and it pisses me off. But there's some times when I think first principles thinking about like, what is the problem here? If again, men and women, consenting adults want to monetize their bodies, monetize their sexuality, consume sexuality, what's the problem? Market as adult, allow people to subscribe, move on with their lives.
I hear you, and I think a lot of the core principles that you say are good, but I'm with Elli on this. I think if you have a tool that is mainly about the public conversation, and as you said, there are tools for the rest of, like for porn, there's a lot of like very highly monetizing. So if you wanted to do xxx.com, that could have been a great application.
It's great.
But for X, just one X, the public conversation, I want it to be slightly cleaner, slightly more to the point, slightly less anti-Semitic, slightly less racist. I think it's a great tool for democracy and a great tool for humanity to have a strong, healthy public conversation. And I want that tool dedicated for that. And once you have different dedication for the same tool, the tool sucks, right? And becomes a lesser of a tool. And I think as a person who worked at Twitter and really believes in the mission of the public conversation, I think that I'm okay with not having porn there. I wish he would open xxs.com and leave X clean.
I think we're in violent agreement. I think that I deeply agree with engaging in the conversation of sex. That's incredibly important. And there's many cultures that do it so much better than North America. There are incredible sources of data that do confirm what you said, that legalizing sex workers makes it more safe. And we can look at that also in the conversation around legalization of certain explicit drugs as well, and have that as an entire conversation. But I think that the town hall is really as functional as the individuals on it. There's a network effect. And if there is a certain predominant group that's attracted to the platform because of these types of changes, it does inherently change the conversation. I think, to me, I see this as a nail in the coffin for X. I think it's really tragic. I think if Twitter used to be a trusted and legitimate platform for everyone, from journalists and working professionals and colleagues, to express ideas and comedy and maybe some political rhetoric, for sure, those days I think are gone, because now if you are introducing really explicit pornographic material on this platform in a real way, it's like, I'm not going to put my X handle at the end of this podcast and say, go and follow me on X, because I don't want to show up next to that kind of content. And to me, I think that I see right through this in some ways. I think this shows how desperate Elon is for users. I think that we know adding explicit content increases monetization. You can look at the history of Tumblr. You know, Tumblr was inherently a porn site, and the moment they were forced to take porn down, its value went from 1.1 billion to 3 million. And I think that there's, I would say, a more realist view that I take about why he's doing this, and he can put it under the guise of free speechism. But I think that ultimately he's doing it under these grossly veiled pretenses of free speech, but it's just a desperate grab for daily active users, and I think it's pathetic. I certainly believe in increasing the conversation around sex and sex work for safety. I think it's completely different when you're talking about individuals who are creating their own content versus a generative AI world. A world in which generative AI can take the likenesses of one individual and create explicit content against their will. This is not only wrong, but it puts kids in harm's way. There was a recent podcast episode from the New York Times and the Daily telling the story of a teen bullying situation using Nudify apps in high schools, where the boys are creating all of this explicit materials of their female peers. And I'm terrified about that. I don't have kids yet, but I'm terrified for that world.
But I do think this is a slightly orthogonal topic though, Elli. Like, I think protecting women and girls and everybody from fake content, fake news, the use of their image is an important topic, but I think it's related to society in general, platforms in general, private chat rooms, WhatsApp and whatever, you know, between kids, where they might be creating all sorts of things to bully each other online. I think it's slightly different than the question of, is pornography, hate speech, and other content that is less desirable or outright disgusting, is it part of the public conversation? And is suppressing it constructive or destructive to the conversation? Again, I'm in a very awkward position here because I don't like a lot of what Elon has done. And there's a very subtle nuance that I'm trying to draw. You know, Amir, I so fully believe in Twitter as the product that the Twitter company couldn't kill. Elon's changes have been mostly destructive. People don't want to be in an uncomfortable platform. These are all things I believe. But there's a subtlety, a line here on the spectrum where curating the town hall turns into suppressing important parts of society and speech, such that we live in this kind of bubble where we pretend hate speech or other kinds of undesirable things don't exist. There is an argument for bringing some of it into the light and having those people debate and discuss if it was done with more class and taste than Elon is currently doing it with. And I just don't think he's doing it particularly well.
And I think that's the thing that I really would like to say, which is that I think it really matters who is the one leading that charge. I think it really does matter who's the person behind it. And frankly, how much empathy, to bring it back to that discussion about empathy and social awareness and understanding of our social contracts and our systems of governance that we've developed and that we all live by, I think that that matters who it's coming from. And I think it matters across a lot of different spaces. So I personally believe that it is the same for violent rhetoric, by the way, between explicit content like porn or violent rhetoric. Just because you have the right to free speech doesn't mean you have the right to diminish my safety in a public space. I also believe that it's really important to have town halls. I also believe, I can hold all of these things at once. I also believe that the way that the internet and social media has changed the ability for individuals who have extremist ideologies to connect with each other in communities that hasn't existed previously, where they used to, yes, they were in silos and disconnected around the world and they were not talking to each other. And now they found this group of other individuals with their shared beliefs and ideologies. So I can hold all of those things at once.
I've got actually an interesting analog, which speaks to your point, Elli, that it often has to do with the character of the company and the people leading the company and the way in which it's implemented and the amount of trust that people have in it. So Google, the search engine, has had porn freely available and hate speech freely available for a long time. And, it's so normalized now that nobody thinks about it. There were some controversies about it in the mid-2000s when Google was becoming a more popular search engine. But because they had principles and then they had some subtlety and nuance about how they implemented porn. So I actually worked next to the so-called porn team at Google when I was back there in Zurich. And it was funny, they were the most buttoned up people, which I guess they had to be to have legitimacy. And their principle was, if you're searching for porn, you should get porn. If you're searching for not porn, you should never get porn. And that was their core principle, right? And similarly with hate speech, I remember, there was some issue around anti-Semitic websites, and they took out ads on their own platform to say, this is why we allow this stuff, but we don't censor things. And because they had clear principles and clear ways of trying to make this safe, people accepted it. Now, Elon Musk, we're sort of one constituency here, but I don't trust the guy. And I think, Elli, that's where you're coming from too. It's like when Elon says we're going to have porn on Twitter, there's no sense that he's going to be thinking about how to make it safe, because he talks like a free speech absolutist and there's no room for that nuance there.
Yeah, I think that just to connect to what you're saying, Yaniv, when we were at Google, there was this principle of do no evil. I don't think that that's a principle in X. I think doing evil is somewhat of a principle in what's happening on Twitter right now, on the actual conversation. So an evil conversation actually is promoted. I think you're 100% right. You need to have some opinionated approach in order to do this right. And empathy is key here.
I will say, inexplicably, having dialed my usage of X all the way to 0 almost, I would start getting notifications from right-wing commentators, breaking crazy right-wing conspiracy proven, breaking blah, blah, blah. And it does actually feel like some of this stuff is being promoted in a weird way. I do think, though, what you said, Yaniv, is so important, because one of the things I really want from our show is to be careful about these knee-jerk reactions of that's bad, that's good, and the Frogut is free, but it's cursed. And it's I think you're right. There's such a subtlety here, which is what you were describing around Google does it, but we trust Google, and we trust them to have nuance and sophistication around this. And so why couldn't someone we trust with subtlety and nuance and taste and judgment do this on a platform like X? If it's the town hall, if it's the town square, well, guess what? Down that alleyway in the town square, there is the red light district. And down there are the people who are talking hate speech. And down there are the aristocrats. And down there are the intellectuals, right? And those down there are the psychedelics, right? They're all in the town. They're all in our town. If we were to trust the person in charge and trust their motives and trust their capacity for delicate execution, I think we would feel less badly about this. And I want that nuance. I like that this group of people can tease that nuance out, that there's more to this than just hate speech bad. And I think that's a really important thing. And, you were saying, Elli, they didn't have a place to connect. And that's the part where I'm disagreeing. I think, no, they were connected on forums and on 4chan and other things. At least this is now in the light. It's visible. And with the right subtleties, the right delicacy, the right filters, you should be able to control your experience on X. Can Elon Musk build that experience? I don't know, and I don't think so. So it might be a moot point anyway.
Yeah, I completely agree. I want the nuance too. And I think that those things, I think that they do exist in the town. And it's important to be we have to find ways to reduce silos and reduce echo chambers. And if we only have specific platforms for specific groups talking within their specific ideologies, then those echo chambers and those silos only persist and get worse. And I think it is incredibly important to have shared spaces and shared ideology and be able to exist in violent agreement or respectful disagreement or engage in conversations. I think that's incredibly important. I think that elections should be the way that we find individuals who we trust to govern and create those spaces both in the real world and online. Democratic process should be the way that we do that. I think that there's a difference between selecting and choosing content. Like Google's had massive flubs, obviously, in the last year around prompt adjustments and things to be able to try to create a more woke, for lack of a better term, AI model. And I think there's a difference between choosing and making that choice for you versus regulating and creating a safe environment. And I think that they're trying to figure that out, and all of them are. But I think if you don't believe that some action is safe in the real world, out in a face-to-face environment, IRL, then it's not safe online for the public. And I think that we have to find a way to bring the experiences of our IRL into digital space. I think that's the answer, because I think if you don't believe that it's safe for someone to take some certain action in a public sphere, like on the subway, then it's probably not safe for them to be able to take a similar action. And so if we look at the real world, okay, we've all agreed more or less what we can and can't do in the real world. Let's try to find ways to mimic that online. And I think if you had someone who had nuance and empathy and someone that I trusted, absolutely.
All right. An awesome and thrilling conversation at the intersection of politics, culture, tech. That's what this show is about. Thank you so much for that, Elli, Amir, Yaniv, as always. And I'm really excited. I think this show is at its best when we can find those intersections where we can look behind the headlines to talk about the individuals and personalities involved and look past the knee-jerk reactions. So I think this was a real killer episode. Elli, how can people find you? I presume not on X anymore. Where can they follow you online?
Yeah, in lieu of a better alternative right now, they can find me on LinkedIn. My name is Elli Hanson, and it's been such a pleasure to be here. Thanks so much for the opportunity to chat with you guys.
Absolute pleasure.
And Amir?
Yeah, not on Twitter, please. On LinkedIn, Amir Shevat, or on Blue Sky.
I'm also on LinkedIn, or, if you like, you can sign up to my OnlyFans. How about you, Chris?
No, I've definitely already signed up to your OnlyFans, Yaniv. It's a thrill a minute.
Much safer than Twitter.
Yeah, absolutely. Although the shine from your head is distracting. But you can follow me on all the social media at Chris Saad, including chrissaad.com and chrissaad.com/newsletter, where I control my own distribution and my own town square. Follow us along there. And don't forget, guys, if you've been listening to a few episodes of the show, getting lots of value, we ask you to please honor and respect the startup podcast Pact, which asks you, first and foremost, to follow us on YouTube, because it's growing there and the algorithm is starting to enjoy us, and that's helping with distribution. And also subscribe to us on your favorite podcasting app. Give us a review and a rating and a shout out on your favorite social network. Helps us grow the show, helps us help more founders. Otherwise, until next time, we'll catch you later.
See ya.
Bye. Today's episode of the Startup Podcast was brought to you by Vanta. To sell to the enterprise, proving security is essential. Vanta allows you to breeze your way through to SOC 2, ISO 27001, or Essential 8 compliance and unlock major growth for your company. Go to vanta.com/TSP today. That's VANTA.com/TSP for the Startup Podcast to claim your $1,000 off.